Father was the keeper of the Eddystone Light, and he slept with a mermaid one fine night. From this union there came three, a porpoise and a porgy, and the other was me. Oh, 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 the wind blows free. Oh, for a life on the rolling sea. Yeah.
Clem personifies Alaska.
The work that Clem did went way beyond Alaska. It had worldwide impacts.
I look to him as one of the wise men.
It wasn't like he was a TV star or a front-page politician, but he was doing extremely important work.
I think he sees himself charging up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt.
You damn sure knew who he was.
Clem's not concerned about what you think of him.
He can put the knife in on a political issue and twist and turn, and the next day work with you on something.
He was a Republican, but nonetheless was not at all reluctant to say, just because the Democrats are pushing this idea doesn't mean I have to oppose it.
If somebody brought me a fisheries issue concerning Alaska, Clem's the guy I'd go to.
Clem's legacy is one of making sure you're really taking care of the resource for the long term and taking care of Alaska.
This land is beautiful. It's harsh, but I don't want a land of milk and honey. You know, I want something of codfish and brown bears, you know. We are in Halibut Cove, and Ismailof Island is there, and that forms the harbor of the village of Halibut Cove, but all of this is Halibut Cove. I pulled into here and I knew I was home. We've got a good little community. You know, it's there are a bunch of oddballs, but then, you know, you don't expect anything different. It's Alaska.
That's what makes you fit in here, though. Everyone's a little different. Everyone's a little off, you know. So let's go out on an island in the middle of nowhere.
I'm certain that Clem has influenced our being here and staying here. I think he's responsible for what Halibut Cove is.
Everybody here owes a lot to Clem, and we have that sense of community, and I think he's inspired that.
His brow is wet with honest sweat. He earns whate'er he can. And he looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. My family's been in North America since the 1600s. I came here to get land. I came here to build. We won't need but one line right there on the bow. That's all we'll need. Because we don't care what the stern does. Right over the top and down. Okay. That'll do it. Well, the funny thing is that you look around here, and except for the mountains, it looks a great deal like the islands of Maine. And some of my forebears are from there, so it looks like they just moved a beaver from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You went right on building dams. walking along a side of a drop-off here about 150 feet straight down, and building it with a boardwalk was interesting. Here we go. Now, I immigrated here. I had children, and their children have had children. They don't have to understand why. They just have to know that the fish always come first. If you don't put the fish first, you have no future. You're like New England, just scrabbling for this week to try and get by. We were very lucky when the 200-mile limit came in.
Until the Magnuson Act was passed, we exercised jurisdiction over fisheries only out to 12 miles from our coast. Some of these big fishing nations that, fished on an industrial scale, they were coming right up close to the Alaskan shore and scooping up these fish. And the Magnuson Act extended that jurisdiction out to 200 miles. And all of a sudden, we had significant leverage. Later on, we had to renegotiate fishing agreements with all of these different countries. Clem was an advisor to our delegation that was negotiating with the Japanese. It was helpful to have people like Clem who had familiarity with peculiarities of the Japanese fishing industry. I look to him as one of the wise men of the fisheries community.
Biology is as much an art as a science. You can get all the facts you want, but then when that fish goes to sea, you're just part of the game. The state set up a very good system at the Constitutional Convention. Basically, the fish come first. You don't worry about the people come second with that, because if you're going to have anything for your grandchildren, you got to have the fish to ante.
Next up is Clem Tillion.
Nobody's going to invest and risk a great deal of money if any big processor can come in and wipe you out in a matter of a few minutes.
He's 89 years old, yet he remains active today. He's at these council meetings today. He testifies. He's an advocate. If you are in the fish world, you're very much aware of him. He carries a lot of presence.
The resources there. We've got crab, we've got herring, we've got a lot of other things. All we need is a chance to survive.
Commercial fisheries management is complicated, but Clem cares deeply about the small boats and about the fishing communities of Alaska. That's always one of his primary concerns as he works through any management issue. I was introduced to Clem shortly before I was appointed to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. The really controversial issue of the time was how to manage the sablefish and halibut fishery, and whether or not an individual fishing quota share system, which would have been the first in this part of the world, was appropriate. And it was very controversial, and Clem was leading the charge for the state of Alaska. He asked me to organize a meeting, and we packed a room, and his message to people was, this IFQ train is moving. If I have to hit you over the head with a 2x4, this is where I'm taking you.
Pre-1995, when the IFQ fishery was implemented, it was a fishery where anyone that had a bathtub could go out on opening day. And the season to catch 60 million pounds of fish, which typically should last about 5 months, had been reduced to a series of 24-hour openings. They were called derbies.
The fishing derbies became famous for boats sinking, tangles of gear getting lost in the grounds, millions of pounds of product being delivered all at once.
They were horrific. We lost a lot of friends in the industry during that time frame. It was a very difficult time. All the fleet would come in at the same time, and you may have halibut stacked 20 feet high, waiting to be processed in the open. it was madness.
I come from Kodiak, a very independent community, strong-willed. These guys were top producers, and they were adamantly opposed to any kind of a quota share program. I testified in opposition to quota shares at 22 council meetings, and we lost that vote, 6-5, and I remember being so devastated that we had lost. And I'm working with Clem now on some issues out in the Aleutians. And at the end of the day, Alaskans have to work together. And Clem kind of embodies that spirit.
Clem gets a lot of kudos for getting programs that actually benefited the fisherman and the consumer. And in fact, because of the issues that we raised during getting this IFQ, they actually amended the Magnuson Act and added a 10th goal, and that was safety at sea.
That's what Clem saw. He saw the end game, that we could get through all this controversy and get to a place where it was, again, a rational fishery, a fishery you could go fish with your family and not feel like you were putting their lives at risk.
My heroes were the pathfinders, the ones that just went out and did it. The mountain men that showed Lewis and Clark where to go. I ran away when I was 8, I ran away when I was 12, I left for good at 17. I ran away so often that every Friday night Mother would make me change clothes, and then she'd drive me out to a place called the Cove and turn me loose. I was gone. And then on Sunday night she'd honk the horn and I'd come up with some squirrels or some fish. But I was back there alone. And I knew where every twig bent for 20 miles. Honeybee. Italian honeybees. Mussolini's fighting men. And my father used to say a man should always have 2 skills. One manual, one mental. When they lost everything in the crash of 29, I can remember still saying, they're standing in line for a bowl of soup in the city. And I made $80 on the last series of tides, just digging clams. When everything went to hell, he went to the sea. And so to me, I naturally leaned to the sea.
There was, back in the 60s and 70s, a very substantial Japanese offshore fishery fishing in the North Pacific and the Bering Sea. And Clem had a long history of trying to protect Alaska fishery interests from the ravages of the Japanese fleet. The movement towards restricting high-sea salmon fleet had worldwide impacts as far as better environmental fishing practices. At this time, the Japanese do not have an offshore salmon fleet that impacts the salmon returns to Alaska.
About another week or 10 days, they'll be laying eggs. And at first they'll be just the size of ping pong balls, and then they'll get big. Then I'll take those few old ones that are only laying now and then and give them the just rewards for years of faithful service, an axe in the back of the head. Like this thing here. My love is like a red, red rose, newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody so swiftly played in tune. Oh, fair they are, my bonny lass, and deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. God, she was a beautiful girl, and I was a homely son of, you know. How I got her has been a mystery to me. And asked why she went with me, and she said, all the other men wanted to get me in bed. You wanted to build a family. You had dreams. So I guess my dreams won out over my looks because they weren't much.
Just the story of how they met is very romantic. It's an interesting combination of pragmatism and romanticism.
I couldn't marry a girl that I couldn't bring home to my father, the old colonel. But there wasn't a moment that I saw Diana that I didn't know. Here's one he'd say, grab that girl or you're a total idiot. So I asked her out and brought her here and then set her down after showing her everything and said, now, my intentions are honorable. I want to marry you. I want a wife and at least 3 children. This is my first date. And if you're not interested, we can stop it now, but if you're interested, I'll court for whatever length of time it takes. She said, finally, for openers, what's your first name?
Dad and Mom were really quite a pair. And Mom was very independent and was an independent artist, and just that was what she wanted. She didn't want a family life to rob her of her talent.
I miss Diana in Clem's life. She adored this man. Clem can have rough edges. He would be the first to admit that. And Diana somehow softened those edges.
Dad was a wild thing, pretty much untamable. She was really stern with Dad. I mean, she was really stern with Dad. Yeah. And if things weren't going in the proper fashion, he basically went to the coal shed and got dealt with. Yeah.
I was in love and didn't know it. I was a man. All I could think of was sex. And when she got sick, I realized that I was in love. And the excitement of holding her while she was sick was as great as any excitement I had. You know, that was there's nothing better than having your sweetheart's head on your shoulder at night, you know. I've become a very firm believer in love. Ah, yes, chickens. Everybody thinks that I have ice water for blood. Just literally was without feeling. They didn't see the quart of Maalox and my wife rubbing the back of my head at night. Jay Hammond, at about age 40, the young bush pilot dressed up to go to the legislature. When I went to Juneau, why, we were the 2 fishermen, and we were the Bambi lovers, as they called it. We were the conservationists. He was like my big brother.
Samuel!
Well, I'd like to see you carrying something. I wouldn't want the feet to get soft. Hey.
How you doing?
Oh. We formed a coalition that gave us a decent return on our oil. And it wasn't Republican, it wasn't Democrat. Chancey Croft and Terry Miller and I were on the same side.
Hammond and Tillion were constantly saying, what's the bottom line? What do we get out of this? And certainly by the early 70s, that was a big element of political discussion, was what do we get out of oil development?
When oil started flowing, money started flowing, and a lot of ideas were on the table, and a lot of ideas had to do with how to spend all that money and what to do with it.
People looked at Alaska as a place to plunder. It was like a strip mine. We saw the permanent fund when we did it as a way of converting a non-renewable resource to a renewable resource.
The father of the permanent fund, Hugh Malone, from the Kenai Peninsula, had the idea in '75 that we should not use the lease bonuses to fund all of them to fund the operating government. Malone was saying we shouldn't use all of that $100 million. We should start putting it into a permanent fund. This is a good time to do it. And Hammond vetoed it. He wanted a constitutional amendment. But Clem, who had been appointed by Hammond to the Senate, stood up and said, in effect, I think the exact words were, "My governor is wrong on this. This is the time that we need to do it. We can do the constitutional amendment as well next year, but we can't do it this year, and we need to set this principle."
I figured politics is only a step away from war. In fact, Clausewitz, back in 1754, when he said, "War is part of the intercourse of the human race, an extension of politics that is separated from normal business merely by the shedding of blood." And so I went to the legislature to do battle.
Clem represented what we always needed to remember about Alaska. You can have both significant development and still preserve the resources. He was from Halibut Cove, and Halibut Cove in the early 1900s was this tremendous fishery, but the fish left and they didn't come back. And Clem always remembered it. You could ruin it if you didn't protect it.
Alaska's resources on salmon had been depleted as a territory to 1/8 of what they are today. And Clem, as state senator, said, "Look, if we have to, we're going to close these fisheries down and rebuild."
For all those years I was in the legislature, I made it very plain that the fish came first. There were a lot of people that knew what to do, but very few of them had the guts to do it when it got rough. We shut everything for 10 years. It was a crime to be caught with a king salmon at Cook Inlet, including a native for subsistence. You know, it was kind of tough. There were lodges going bankrupt at Anchor Point. Fishermen weren't making it.
Clem was out front saying this is going to take 10 years to rebuild, but this resource will come back. And now it's a $1 billion fishery, just salmon alone in Alaska, and the #1 employer in Alaska.
We shut her, and we brought them back.
His biggest imprint is in fisheries politics. Whether it was with limited entry or whether it was IFQs or whatever policy came in, that there were winners and there were losers. And the losers hated him.
Yeah, well.
Sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug.
Yeah, yeah, right. We were the bug today.
Yeah. He perhaps lacks empathy, so he's not burdened by the need to feel someone else's pain when they're gonna, suffer a pretty severe economic blow because the policy that's needed to be put in place to protect the resource is gonna pretty much screw him. I know I've never really been interested in a public life or political life. I really don't like people hating me. It's just not something I really care for, especially just shy of half the population. That's pretty rough. I think most people get that way at some point in their life where there's a certain group of people who are gonna hate you, but they hate you for reasons that you know that you're on the long-term correct path.
I played it like it was war. And that if you failed, it led to bloodshed. But if you did it well, it led to peace and organization. There are some regrets. I hurt people unnecessarily, that bothers me. I also didn't hurt them when I should have. And that bothers me. You know, it's like that reporter that is still in Kodiak. She said, doesn't it bother you that everybody hates you? And I said, well, I hope my wife doesn't. And the rest of you are quite immaterial. My job is to save the fish. You know, it's just been a good life. The whole secret is your mate. And when the young fishermen, they asked me, what's the best route to success? I said, marry well. If you really want to build something, you got to have a partner. Ah, yes. It's a grand place to live. It's everything I could have hoped for. Now we'll see what the next generation does with it.